Our good friend Bob Alexander posted a piece from The Intercept on Facebook, and I got a notice about it. And I wonder if you know about it. I didn't. Had Bob Alexander not sent this to me, a link to this, I wouldn't have known about it. I'm talking about the U.S. government quietly declassified that post 9/11 interview with Bush and Cheney. Remember that? Huh? I remember talking about that when it occurred, the fact that neither one of them agreed to show up and testify under oath. That was the central issue for me in finding out that these two bastards, these two war criminals, one of whom was a war criminal by default because George Bush was an ignorant bastard, and the other one by design. I'm talking about Dick Cheney. Yes, I know, Liz Cheney's father. But the interview was conducted. It took 3 years. It wasn't until 2004 that these two agreed to testify before the 911 committee. So there's a little bit of information now that is coming out, and this is thanks to Jeremy Scahill writing at The Intercept, and again, thanks to Bob Alexander for getting this out. And if you remember, one of the people who had the least amount of, I don't want to say respect, because Bob had zero respect for George W. Bush, as neither did I. So I would put Bob Alexander and I probably close to the same level of contempt and disgust about George W. Bush. But it was Bob Alexander who organized and then brought to fruition this effort to get the book out by, what's his name, the prosecutor who went after the Manson family. I always draw a blank on his name. He's Italian. I know that much. But it was the case for indicting George W. Bush on murder charges, how that could have been very easily accomplished by any county prosecutor, like Fannie Willis is going after Trump here. And Bob sent a copy of the book that laid out the case against George W. Bush and how to prosecute him to every prosecutor in this country who was the prosecutor of a county where at least one American person died fighting in Iraq. And the charge was murder. And the case was so well put together that Bob and the people who helped him and me and a lot of folks were just shocked beyond belief that nobody took Bob Alexander's cover letter and read the book and said, yeah, he can be tried for murder, George W. Bush. So this is what was in The Intercept. On Wednesday, that would be last Wednesday, as the eyes of the U.S. public were focused on Tuesday's midterm election results, a U.S. government panel quietly released a newly declassified summary of an Oval Office joint interview conducted with President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney about the September 11 attacks. The interview, carried out by members of the 9/11 Commission, was not recorded, and the summary document constitutes the only known official record of the meeting. The meeting took place April 29, 2004. Now, according to the document drafted by the Commission's executive director, that was Philip Zelikow, let me quote. Quote, the President and Vice President were seated in chairs in front of the fireplace. The President's demeanor throughout was relaxed. He answered questions without notes. The portrait of George Washington was over the fireplace, which was flanked by busts of Lincoln and Churchill. Paintings of southwestern landscapes are on the wall. It was a beautiful spring day, end quote. Now, this document, whose declassification was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, is not an official transcript, but it is described as, quote, a memorandum for the record, end quote. and it was authorized for release by the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. Now, let me just make note here. You see what's going on here. Since it is not an official transcript, it cannot be used as evidence against these two criminals. Bush and Cheney were never placed under oath, so their testimony is not subject to the penalties of what am I trying to say? The penalties of, oh, God, I hate these brain farts. Lying under oath, or in any manner, treason against the United States, perjury, of course, the word I'm trying to think of. God, I'm so funny. But as Jeremy points out, one of the most striking aspects of this declassified document is the apparent absence of even a glimmer of self-awareness by George W. Bush, which is not going to come as a surprise to you or Bob Alexander or me. Not a glimmer of self-awareness by George W. Bush about the significance of the death and destruction he was unleashing with his global war on terror. Remember that? The interview of Bush and Cheney took place just as a massive insurgency was erupting in Iraq against a U.S. occupation. We were already there in 2004, April 29, 2004, when this interview took place. But this massive insurgency was erupting in Iraq against U.S. occupation that would kill thousands of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Now, Scahill points out that the document is a rough transcript and a summary. And in it, Bush comes off as almost childishly simplistic in his insights and his analysis of what occurred. I think we know, those of us who were fully conscious during the Bush years are fully aware that this idiot, George W. Bush, was simplistic from top to bottom. So coming off as childishly simplistic in his insights about what happened and his analysis about what happened on September 11th is not a surprise. The lack of any sensitive information contained within the document, and there isn't any. This is what Scahill is saying. The fact that there is no sensitive information in the document should raise questions as to why it took more than 18 years to be made public. Now, Scahill points out from the start that this document doesn't contain any groundbreaking revelations, but it does offer some new texture to the internal events in the Bush crime family immediately following the attacks. For example, that morning after the first plane hit the World Trade Center, Bush was reading The Pet Goat with second-grade students at Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. Bush told the commissioners during this interview that he had seen the first plane hit, but he thought it was an accident. From the report, quote, he recalled that he and others thought the building had been hit by a twin-engine plane. He remembered thinking, what a terrible pilot, end quote. Now, according to Scahill, soon after the second plane hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center at 9:03 a.m., the chief of staff to Bush, Andy Card, approached Bush as he sat listening to the students reciting passages from The Pet Goat. And Andy Card told Bush that it appeared the U.S. was under attack. The commissioners who did this questioning of Bush and Cheney then asked Bush why he continued to sit in the classroom. According to the notes about this hearing, quote, he said he was trying to absorb the news. He remembered a child or someone reading. He remembered watching the press pool and noticing them talking on their phones. He realized the country was watching his behavior. He had to send the right signals. He wanted to collect his thoughts. He felt he should project calm and strength until he could understand better what was happening. He thought it was important to keep his body language calm in the face of danger. As the president, he was conscious that, quote, people act off me, end quote. Now, Scahill writes that perhaps the most interesting passage from this document, or passages, I should say, relate to the extent to which Dick Cheney was empowered to effectively take command authority that morning. Bush told the hearing commissioners that he was pressured to get on Air Force One, so he, quote, made some quick remarks and blasted out of there, end quote. Cheney, Bush recalled, urged him, quote, don't come home, end quote. Cheney, quote, told him that Washington was under attack. Cheney strongly recommended that Bush delay his return to Washington. There was no telling how much more the threat might be. The president agreed reluctantly, end quote. Now, when I quote things here, it's from the notes that were released as the declassified post 9/11 interview. Now, according to Scahill, once Cheney was at the helm inside the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, that was an underground bunker beneath the east wing of the White House, he, Cheney, and Bush discussed the rules of engagement for the evolving situation, including confronting other potential hijacked aircraft. Bush reportedly told Cheney, quote, yes, engage the enemy. You have the authority to shoot down an airplane, end quote. Also, according to this so-called report, quote, the president understood this from his experience at the Texas Air National Guard. He had been trained to shoot down planes. He understood generally how this worked. One plane would lock on and one would ID. He understood the consequences for the pilot, how a pilot might feel to get the order to shoot down a U.S. airliner. It would be tough, end quote. Scahill goes on to describe how the document talks about a chaotic scene with communications equipment failing and Bush being overwhelmed with rumors and reports about other potential targets, including Air Force One and his private ranch in Crawford, Texas. According to the report, Bush, quote, had heard of the fog of war. That day he saw it firsthand. He wanted to go back to D.C., end quote. Instead, Bush was flown to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana while Cheney ran things from the bunker under the White House. And the document states that during this period of time, that secure phone line between Bush and Cheney kept failing. Bush also tried to reach Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, but Bush said in his testimony that, quote, they couldn't find him, end quote. Bush, quote, was very frustrated about not being able to make contact with different people. He also complained that there was not good television on Air Force One, end quote. He was eventually moved to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, where he had better secure communications equipment. And Bush would spend some 9 hours aboard Air Force One that day. Remember, they just kept flying him from place to place. And they didn't return him to the White House until 7 p.m. Now, according to The Intercept, Cheney, excuse me, this is according to the report, Cheney gave direct authorization to the military to shoot down civilian aircraft after being presented with intelligence that these planes had been hijacked. Quote, then they heard that an aircraft was down in Pennsylvania. The vice president thought we'd shot it down. It took a while to sort this out. In the next half hour, there were 2 or 3 occasions like this, a report of an incoming. Would he reiterate authorization? Yes, in every case. though the problem was resolved without shots being fired, end quote. And according to the declassified notes, there were 5 additional reports of additional hijackings that all turned out to be false. When one of these interviewers on the 9/11 Commission pressed Cheney about apparent discrepancies in the timeline of when exactly Bush gave the vice president authority to order the shooting down of U.S. civilian planes, quote, the president said, look, he didn't give orders without my permission, end quote. Now, again, according to Scahill, writing in The Intercept, one of the 9/11 commissioners, quote, asked if the president or the vice president had been involved in permitting planes carrying Saudi nationals to leave after 9/11. Remember that? Every single aircraft in this country was grounded, every single aircraft, except the ones ordered by the Bush administration, probably Dick Cheney, to round up important Saudi nationals and spirit them out of the country under military protection. So, asked if the president or vice president had been involved in permitting planes carrying these Saudi thugs to leave, no, George Bush said. He had no idea about this until he read about it in the papers. Cheney, the document noted, quote, also gave a negative answer, but added that his answer was, quote, hard to hear. So let me move away from Scahill's report. So what does that mean? That neither well, I'll tell you what it means. Neither the president or vice president, neither one of these bums, neither one of these fucking war criminals, Cheney or Bush, took responsibility for ordering the shoot down of that plane in Pennsylvania. And I wish the truth would finally come out, that the reason the plane in Pennsylvania crashed, well, it didn't crash, the reason it was blown up out of the sky was because it was on, I guess, a course to crash into D.C., and it was ordered shot down. I feel deathly sorry for the, 75, 80 people on that flight. But they did not commandeer that aircraft, or attempt to commandeer the aircraft and force it to crash and sacrifice their lives for 300 million Americans. That did not happen, said Mike Malloy, who doesn't know shit. But I think I do at this point. Yeah, it's been 18 years, 22 years since that event, 21 years. But I cannot believe, I have questions about the entire day, but I cannot believe the mythology that is built up now. And no offense to the people on that plane or the surviving families. I mean, it is what it was. And there's no way I can think of to avoid that. It happened. The plane, but if you look at the debris field of that plane, experts have said that's not what happens when a plane crashes. It doesn't leave a debris field like that. That's what happens when a plane is hit with a missile in flight and is blown to pieces. And pieces of that aircraft fell within what, an 8, 10, 12-mile radius, whatever it was? And yet we're supposed to believe that that plane was deliberately crashed by the passengers on board. Getting back to what Scahill has here, several 9/11 commissioners raised the issue of the infamous presidential daily briefing from August 6th, about a month before this happened, 2001, the one that was entitled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States. And that document, if you remember, we talked about this, oh God, did we? That document cites foreign intelligence indicating that Osama bin Laden wanted to hijack U.S. aircraft in an effort to free Islamic extremist prisoners held by the U.S. on terror convictions. It also stated, that report, that presidential daily brief, also stated that the FBI had information, quote, that indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks, including recent surveillance, of federal buildings in New York, end quote. And then this war criminal little fucker, George W. Bush, repeatedly rejected the idea that he had received any so-called actionable intelligence. And he said it was just a, quote, general assessment that this was going to happen, and that he had personally requested information that ultimately led to the production of that specific briefing. Bullshit. Bush told the commissioners during this hearing, quote, it reaches the conclusion that bin Laden wants to attack us. Yeah, the president commented, he's trying to do that. So's Al-Qaeda, end quote. Bush claimed that none of the briefings he received, quote, were commenting on a threat in America. There was no actionable intelligence on such a threat, not one, end quote. And Bush also in that hearing told the commissioners that CIA Director George Tenet had told him, Bush, quote, the threat was overseas. That's what Mr. Tenet said. And Bush added, George Tenet said he thought that if there had been a serious concern in August, he would have known about it. End quote. So this declassified document also contains some, as Jeremy Scahill puts it, some reflections from Bush and Cheney on the initial stages of the so-called War on Terror. Bush complained that U.S. allies were reluctant to join in the global assassination program implemented after 9/11. The commission report said this, quote, on bringing terrorists to justice, their approach was not as tough as ours, the approach of foreign governments. Foreign governments were less willing to kill them, to go after them in the remote places of the world. Our own agencies, this is according to the president, were pretty darn robust, end quote. And Vice President Cheney also was pissed off at congressional oversight of covert operations, particularly those run by the CIA. And Cheney said that congressional oversight had weakened that agency. He said, quote, the standards that had been applied to the intelligence community had left them inclined to be risk-averse. The penalties were high for getting involved in actions that might be judged to be inappropriate, end quote. And according to notes, Cheney, quote, mentioned the examples of being of having nasty people on the CIA payroll. The officials then try to be careful. They don't take things on, end quote. Now, if you remember, during his entire career in government, Cheney, whether it was as a member of Congress or one of Nixon's gophers, Cheney hated congressional oversight. He wanted to operate like any good fascist would, completely independent of anybody telling the Fuhrer what to do. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.